I should probably explain the clickbait in the title before talking about anything else. This video is not going to answer the question of whether or not Future Redeemed is the best game in the Zeno series. It is instead going to be discussing another weird idiosyncrasy with the way I think about Zeno games, and how Future Redeemed relates to that. There is a reason Peak Xeno is in quotation marks in the title, and it's because I'm not finding the peak of the Zeno series. Peak Xeno is a transient status that various Zeno games can obtain and lose throughout their narratives as they go on, that represents the greatest parts of the series, not just in terms of quality, but also in accomplishing the things the series sets out to try and do. Basically, Peak Xeno is hype moments and aura, but the writing is also good, and only gets better the bigger a fan of the Zeno series as a whole you are. While the topic is an all-encompassing Zeno series one, I am only going to be spoiling the trilogy of numbered Xenoblade games and Future Redeemed, just so people who haven't played Gears and Saga and people who are looking forward to playing Xenoblade X for the first time in a couple months will actually be able to watch it. This entire video is more or less talking about an idiosyncrasy I have in my own mind when I think about the series, so I think I should be a bit upfront with this. Besides maybe the original Wii version of Xenoblade 1, I am pretty sure I like all of the full-length Xenoblade games, the entire trilogy and X, more than I do Future Redeemed, purely for personal reasons, preferring longer form experiences, and the idea that because the full-size games are so much longer, they have more good content than there is total content in a shorter expansion campaign. That being said, they're longer and might have similar highs to Future Redeemed, but because they have so much content, and because the story is longer, and as such will have to have a few more points of downtime, it's impossible to keep things up at the same high caliber for the entire game. Despite preferring that structure on a fundamental level, I think I would also say that all 4 full-length Xenoblade games have lower lows than Future Redeemed does. The question isn't, is Future Redeemed the objectively best Xeno entry? But if all Xeno games are able to achieve this Peak Xeno status at least one point during their run, is Future Redeemed the one that hits it the longest and most consistently? I think I can make a pretty compelling case for yes, and that is in large part due to a few factors that make it a lot easier to achieve something like that in Future Redeemed compared to any other game. The first, of course, is the shorter length. The more condensed it is, the easier it is to polish, the less extraneous systems you need to worry about, and the more time and focus can be spent on every single little moment of the experience. It is easier to make a nearly perfect short thing than it is to finish a much longer thing at all. The second factor is just that Monolith has gotten really good at working with the Switch. Technically, the first Switch game they actually worked on was Xenoblade 2, because I believe the Switch version of Breath of the Wild was a port not actually made by the original developers, but Future Redeemed was 6 years later, at least 3 iterations of their engine and workflow, and also came with several other pieces of experience from things like Tears of the Kingdom. Yes, Xenoblade XDE is going to be their actual last game on the original Switch, but I do think Future Redeemed is going to end up being the most system limit pushing thing they put out in the Xenoblade series for it, just because X is still at its core going to be the Wii U game unless they're changing a lot more under the hood than it initially looks like from the couple trailers we've gotten. Similar to how Xenoblade 1DE is definitely the least technically impressive game of the numbered trilogy on the Switch, because ultimately, as improved as the visuals and quality of life were, it is still the skeleton of the Wii game. Then, on top of all the technical things, Xenoblade 3 is the culmination of everything Monolith has learned from the series gameplay-wise, and Future Redeemed is a condensed, distilled version of that too. Remember, 3 is the most Xenoblade X-like game in the numbered series, for a very good reason and in a very good way, and Future Redeemed skews even slightly closer to that than the base game of 3 did. I know base 3's exploration was somewhat controversial, but I think Future Redeemed manages to find a pretty happy medium between that, Xenoblade 2's a bit more dense version of what Xenoblade 1 brought to the table, and X's pure exploration, you gain something gameplay-wise for going anywhere and doing anything philosophy. I love the AP system because you earn resources that improve your characters by doing literally anything in the game. I don't quite know if something like that would cut it in a full-length JRPG, just because you would probably want there to be more systems that require more currencies that you can earn in several different ways just to flesh out all of the gameplay systems. But for something this length, it works well enough for getting anyone who just wants to progress their characters beyond the baseline the story gives you into doing the side content. And when the side content is effectively more stuff in the vein of the best stuff from base game Xenoblade 3, which was already giving top-tier quests from Xenoblade X a run for their money, and, well, X pretty much uncontroversially has the best side content in the series, bolstered by stuff calling back to and mimicking the best of Xenoblade 1 and 2, and, hell, even the worst of Xenoblade 1, but in a very cozy, nostalgic way, it's kinda hard to argue that any game other than maybe X has this consistently good side content. Though I would say X still definitely has the edge in exploration because it is the exploration Xenoblade game. As far as the numbered trilogy goes, are Torna's side quests pound for pound about as good as Future Redeemed? I would say yes, but there is the community requirements that can make it feel like more of a chore than something you're doing for fun because it's there and something you enjoy. And there's also something I just alluded about, the nostalgia factor. Possibly the biggest thing Future Redeemed has going for itself as a consistently peak Xeno experience is that nostalgia factor. The fact that it is not just the final entry in the original story arc of the numbered Xenoblade series, but the fact that it is a culmination of a culmination. Not only of the numbered Xenoblade series, not only including X and say, oh, everything Xenoblade has done in the last 13 years, but going all the way back to Xenogears in 1998, I wouldn't necessarily call it a culmination of all of it, but it is certainly a celebration of, and capstone to, the entire first quarter century of the Xeno series. And, quite frankly, there is no other entry in the series that has that as a claim to fame, and just based on that, considering how a moment being improved by being a big Xeno fan is something that makes Peak Xeno, there is no other entry in the series that has this much concentrated opportunities to do something like that. This game features legally distinct Fei Fong Wong as the protagonist, Alvis as the secondary protagonist, Shulk and Rex as the mentors, Shulk's son and Rex's daughter as the next generation, and name drops Project Exodus and Dmitry Yuriev. Barring all the stuff that was already referenced or called back to in base Xenoblade 3, I'm not sure how much more cool stuff that's amplified by being a big Xeno fan they could have crammed in here, unless Cosmos and the Zohar showed up in person and they ended up using the anima relics to fuel the Ouroboros stone. I think the two closest comparisons we have to that are Xenosaga 3 and Xenoblade 2. The fan service and capstone stuff is there for both of them, but I also think they're very similar to each other in that they have become two of the most beloved Xeno entries, in part because most of their peak Xeno-ness is at the end. I would argue that a lot of X's best story points are near the end of it, but the best part of that game is the post-game and the exploration, so the journey is more important than the destination in that case, and you can't really say that it peaks at the end of the main story when that is, in all honesty, one of the weaker aspects of the game as a whole. As for Xenoblade 1, I definitely believe, and I think a lot of people agree with me, when I say that it goes downhill a little bit after Mechonis Core, and the Zanza arc does not hit the same highs the arc about fighting against Egil hits. As for Xenogears, while the ending is no doubt phenomenal, it's not really as high quality as, say, the end of Disc 1 throughout most of Disc 2 because of the time constraints and format that Disc 2 had to take. Now, you may vehemently disagree with this and think Disc 2 is the best part of the game if you dislike Xenogears' battle system, but I still think that because it was written as a video game, there not being as many parts where there's gameplay does detract from the experience. As for the Saga trilogy, its entries are shorter and much more direct sequels to each other than the Xenoblade trilogy is. So there really are two ways to look at it. Do you think of it as three separate games? or as 3 parts of one full experience that combined is about the same length, if not a little bit longer, than Xenoblade 1, 2, or 3 is. If you view it as 3 separate games, well, Xenosaga 1 has a lot of big ups and downs in quality. I wouldn't call the ending a bad part of the game, but it's definitely not the best part either. Xenosaga 2 pretty much peaks at the beginning and falls off drastically once you get to Disc 2, while Xenosaga 3 is very, very strong throughout, but the last 8 or so hours of that game are honestly in very, very good contention for the absolute best single segment of the entire Xeno series. If you view them as one long game split up between 3 parts, I would still say the average quality of the entire experience is above the average quality of both episodes 1 and 2 separately, purely because of how good 3 is, and it does end up being something that starts off pretty strongly, slows down a little bit at the end of the first third, has a really interesting beginning of Act 2, and very good story points throughout the rest of it, but gameplay-wise leaves a lot to be desired, and then Act 3 is straight gas all the way to the finish line, once again ending with some of the best 8 hours in the entire Xeno series. Xenoblade 2 kind of follows a similar trajectory to this, but I would say it picks up a little bit sooner and has a much more gradual curve to peak at the end. It starts off very strong, and while it is fairly slow-paced, for a lot of it there are just a lot of good vibing and world-building parts, but then obviously Chapter 4 happens, though more or less once Morag joins the party permanently, it just keeps going up and up in quality, and I don't know anyone who doesn't think the last 3 chapters of Xenoblade 3 are the best 3 chapters in the game. I would probably say most of those last 3 qualify as Peak Xeno status, though I would also think a lot of the opening counts as that as well. Remember, Peak Xeno is a status, it's not a title. That means more than one part of a game can be Peak Xeno, and it can gain and lose that status many, many times throughout. Using Xenoblade 1 as an example, obviously the entire Mechonis Core segment, like starting from when you choose to get on Junks heading to Mechonis Core to after you gain control of the party once Shulk wakes up, is Peak Xeno. And while the whole Zanza part of the story is definitely weaker, in terms of something that becomes way more meaningful the more Xeno you're a fan of, Alvis's explanation through the actual end of the game is definitely also Peak Xeno as well. But those aren't the only moments. The Dunban and Mumkar stuff on Valak Mountain is great. A lot of stuff around meeting the Machina for the first time and the big party conversations on the Fallen Arm when everyone's split up is really, really heavily hitting on a lot of the themes of different people coming together that Xeno loves so much. And I would say the opening of the game also qualifies as Peak Xeno. Not just because the introduction to the world of Bionis and Mechonis and the intrigue leading through the Mechon attack is good, but because most of it is a very big spin on the opening of Xenogears that is endlessly interesting to compare and contrast once you're familiar with both of them. Like, I know Future Connected is Future Connected, but I like a lot of the Tyrea stuff there, and Melia's character arc coming to a close is very good. But realistically speaking, we all know this to be true. Xenoblade 1's real ticket to Peak Xeno status is just Egil existing and interacting with other characters. Whenever Egil's on screen, people should be asking, why can't every video game be this peak all the time? The Maineth Shrine confrontation is genuinely so good that you don't even need to talk about the things being made better by being a big Xeno fan part of Peak Xeno. It becomes Peak Xeno on hype moments and aura alone. Anyway, back to Saga 3 and Blade 2. The things that make their endings so good are not just that the actual story of that individual game is coming to a close in a very satisfying way, but that there are a lot of callbacks to earlier in the series, and say it with me, fan service moments for long-term Xeno fans. Xenoblade 2 is very self-explanatory. Xenoblade 1 connections exist, those are massive as is, and then there is an object similar to the Zohar appearing, which makes Xenogears and Xenosaga fans very, very happy. And then there's Klaus more or less directly stating that an infinite Xeno multiverse connected to the Conduit exists, which when combined with a later developer statement not only puts Xenoblade X pretty squarely in the same multiverse as Xenoblade 1, 2, and then later 3, but also pretty much says that yeah, wink wink nudge nudge, legally distinct versions of Gears and Saga exist in the same multiverse as well. In the end, it's all the same upper domain, innit? As for Saga 3, I'm going to try to be very vague here on purpose. In spite of the series getting shortened from 6 games to 3, and a lot of later intended plot points never being able to be visited on at all, Xenosaga 3 does a fantastic job of wrapping up every loose end in the series and ending it on a satisfying, yet still open-ended note in case they were ever able to make more. On top of that, it does do something similar to what Future Redeemed did, just on a shorter scale. It calls back to Xenogears a lot, in addition to all of the big full circle moments from Xenosaga episodes 1, 2, as well as even Pied Piper and Missing Year. I can't even imagine what it felt like to be playing it at the time, as a Xenogears fan who is disappointed that none of the other parts of that series got to be made, because while it doesn't delve into the quote-unquote episode 6 of perfect works that would be a sequel to Gears, it does provide a bit more closure than that game ending on a rushed disc 2 did, and even somewhat fills the void of the missing Xenogears prequels that were also on the Perfect Works timeline as potential other future entries in the series. So then, what happens if you take the incredibly good endings of Xenoblade 2 and Xenosaga 3, all of the fan service, callbacks, and culmination stuff of both of those, and shove it all together in one 20-hour DLC that is basically an extended victory lap ending on top of the already pretty good and fan-servicey ending to the base game of Xenoblade 3. Now, is the ending of Xenoblade 3 Peak Xeno? Parts of it, I guess. I like it a lot better than most people do, and I think people have become a lot warmer on it lately, but I am nowhere near delusional enough to say that the best part of Xenoblade 3 is anything other than the ending of Chapter 5 and beginning of Chapter 6. There are a few Peak Xeno moments throughout the entirety of the main story of 3. That part is obviously the peakest of all. Lots of the ending does have indirect Xenoblade 1 and 2 fan service, and that is great. There's also a lot of Xenoblade X stuff just kind of peppered throughout the main game, especially in stuff regarding the city. But the cool thing that Future Redeemed does is not be an epilogue. If it is just an epilogue, then yeah, you can include all the fan service to the other games. But ultimately, you're still focusing on the main story of Xenoblade 3, and trying to include any future stuff there would just mean condensing a bunch of different ideas for potential entire games in the future into a small expansion story size package, which could have the same vibes as the parts of Gears and Saga that are obviously missing out on a lot of the fleshing out and build-up that would have been in longer versions of the existing games or other games that never got made. And that just wouldn't feel as good. Making it a prequel means that not only can you introduce a brand new story that's able to get more or less fully resolved just in the one entry, but you can also, bizarrely enough, despite this taking place beforehand, add fan service to Xenoblade 3. So it's not just calling back to and providing fan service for fans of Xenogears from 25 years ago, but also the base game of Xenoblade 3 from last year. And then there's the fact that it is the capstone to the first Xeno arc that was largely finished on the developer's own terms. Gears lost all the rest of its games, Saga lost half of it and had to drastically cut down what made it into the games they were able to make, and well, Xenoblade X is only starting to get followed up on and get a complete story now. Yeah, there were things in Xenoblade 2 and probably 3 as well that ended up getting cut, but ultimately, this is the Xenoblade trilogy Monolith Soft wanted to tell, so obviously the capstone to that is going to do a better job of providing fan service because it has a fully complete, coherent story arc to draw upon for that. Also, of the 3 main entries that are concentrated Peak Xeno and provide a lot of fan service, it is the most recent one, which means it has the most other older games to provide fan service to. And the thing is, it isn't just empty fan service. You don't need to have played Gears and Saga, or really even Xenoblade 1 and 2, to be compelled by the story and find it to be a good one. Yeah, you should play the entire numbered Xenoblade trilogy in order, but if you go from base Xenoblade 3 straight into Future Redeemed, honestly, it's good enough where, even though it is chock full of fan service and self-referential stuff, you'll still have a good time. Matthew isn't a great character and protagonist because he looks and fights like Faye, or because his personality is more or less what if Faye and Bart were the same guy. It starts with the fact that he's a genuinely good, well-written, and fully realized character who happens to be those references to the origins of the Zeno series. All of that about Matthew gets revealed almost instantly, and then not too long after that, A starts talking, and people who have no idea who this character is are like, wow, this is going to be a funny dynamic with Matthew. This also seems like another interesting character. And then everyone who's played Xenoblade 1 is like, wow, A really is just the same Alvis we know and love, and is now partnered up with someone closer to Rein than Shulk, who doesn't have a Shulk to rein him in. The game knows it's shorter than base Xenoblade 3, so it immediately gives you establishing character things for the two main characters, and they're both references to past Xeno games, so we're already hitting peak Xeno status long before Shulk and Rex show up, or we learned anything about Vector Industries and Dmitry Yuriev. Now, while I did just say it's still followable if you've only played base Xenoblade 3, one of the best things about Future Redeemed is it is the first sequel in the Xenoblade series to actually assume you've played every other Xenoblade game beforehand. It is both a strength and weakness of Xenoblade 2 and 3 that they're designed from the ground up to be someone's potential first game in the series. It maximizes the amount of potential entry points for new fans, but it does result in a lot of redundancies and people being disappointed that these so-called sequels don't really have a lot of direct connections to the previous games that they probably also were a fan of if they're playing a certain new entry. Future Redeemed, being the DLC capstone to the entire trilogy, ignores this and is just like, alright, you can play this if you haven't played the rest, but you will definitely get more out of this if you have. It doesn't have any redundant explanation, it respects the player's intelligence a lot by not really talking about things that were probably self-evident just by having played the other games, and that means it can cut out a lot of fluff and only focus on the really important relevant stuff specifically to the characters of FR and what's necessary to set up the main game. If you really think about it, the only scenes that have big impacts on the entire Xeno series as a whole are the radio and the very ending post-credit scene. The radio scene also takes place during an important character-rich conversation between characters from Future Redeemed that furthers the story of Future Redeemed. It is a second layer of subtitles on a cutscene that, if you don't care about that stuff, you can completely ignore and still get a ton out of it. It is still a very important, relevant scene that touches on a lot of important Xeno series themes. You don't need the references to the other Xeno games for that to be Peak Xeno. And then the post-credit scene, well, it has implications for the wider series, but ultimately its main deal is being a second perspective on the ending of the base game that shows, even more obviously, that everything the heroes of Ionios did mattered and the worlds will be together again. If you don't like the ending of Xenoblade 3, then yeah, this is the same thing, you're not really going to enjoy this too. But to me at least, that's Peak Xeno even if you don't care about the blue light at the end. And the stuff in between? Well, it is a very abridged Xenoblade story, but it is a Xenoblade story that doesn't have any major low points. It's still extremely emotionally resonant and thematically relevant, not just within Xenoblade 3, but for things that cross the entire series in importance. And it is bolstered by, while a lot simpler than the base game of Xenoblade 3, consistently good Xenoblade gameplay that doesn't overstay its welcome or last long enough to become boring because of its simplicity. Is Future Redeemed my favorite Xeno thing? Definitely not. Is it the objectively best Xeno thing of all time? Probably not as well. But due to just its general quality and a perfect storm of additional factors that lead to it being more special than it would have been if it was released at any other point in the series' history, I can confidently say that Future Redeemed is the most consistently high-quality entry in the entire Xeno series, and that is definitely something worth celebrating. I kind of wanted to get this out now, never really made a thing for its first anniversary or even a formal review, so let's just give Future Redeemed some more flowers before the focus shifts entirely to Xenoblade X Definitive Edition, and then whatever comes beyond. Until next time, when I'm probably just going to be talking about X again, this is Luxon, signing off.